called Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt. Two Arab peasants were collecting topsoil for their vegetable patch.
السبت هذا بالموت بالموت لا لا بالموت هيا تعال كسر صم تعال شوف الموت هذا تعال سب شهادة
Among the material that came to light was a document entitled The Gospel of Thomas, which proved to be a much longer version of the list of sayings found at Oxyrhynchus. It showed that such unconnected lists of sayings continued to circulate even after the time the Gospels were written, suggesting strongly that Schmidt's theory was right. Schmidt's work set the stage for the man who would be the leading figure in biblical research for the next 50 years, Rudolf Bultmann, who from 1921 to 1955 was professor of New Testament studies at Marburg University in Germany. The mythological elements of the Gospels had been identified by Strauss. The framework which knitted together the sayings and deeds of Jesus had been shown by Schmidt to be artificial. What about the sayings and deeds themselves? Were they authentic? If the Gospel authors could invent material to suit their theological purpose, it seemed essential to Bultmann to regard as inauthentic anything which the early church had an obvious motive to invent. Bultmann searched for anything tailor-made for the needs of the early church. A good example is the passage where Jesus asked the apostles who people think he is. It's Peter who replies,
I say you are the Messiah.
Because Bultmann knew that the early church was anxious to establish its belief in Jesus as the Messiah and to establish Peter's authority, he regarded this story as very suspect. Bultmann also found that rabbis had uttered identical words to Jesus even before Jesus was born. The early church could have borrowed these along with the many other Jewish traditions and prophecies.
In this way, Bultmann concluded that quite a lot of stories about Jesus and of sayings attributed to him were developed by the earliest Christians and transmitted orally down the years until they reached the evangelists who strung them together like beads on a connecting string of the consecutive story of a gospel.
For Bultmann, not only were the stories of Jesus' nativity, infancy, miracles and resurrection mythological, so were many of Jesus' ordinary deeds and sayings. So what was left? Bultmann felt no reason to doubt Jesus' baptism by John the Baptist, nor that he went about teaching in Galilee and Jerusalem. He also accepted that this activity finally led to Jesus' crucifixion. The one unique characteristic of Jesus was his proclamation of the kingdom of God. There was little more hard information that Bultmann felt could be recovered. When Bultmann published his findings, it caused an immediate controversy. Some scholars complained that it was a Jesus book without Jesus. In the midst of this clamour, Bultmann himself remained a devout and pious Christian. His work led him to develop a theology which kept faith separate from the historical problems.
Our knowledge of Jesus is paltry. There is no proof that all the words attributed to Jesus were spoken by him. Even the oldest layer is the result of a complicated historical process which we can no longer trace. Now, no sane person can doubt that Jesus stands as founder of Christianity. And for those whose interest is in the personality of Jesus, this situation is depressing and destructive. But I tell you, my friends, historical research could never serve as a basis for faith. A picture of the historical Jesus is not necessary for the faith of the church. I know this is a stumbling block, a scandal for rational thinking, but we must set aside the Jesus of history and embrace the Christ of faith.
Bultmann's reasoning has had great influence. And if Christians are surprised at the extent to which the historical reliability of the Gospels has been thrown into doubt by scholarship, it's largely because the Church has adopted his view that the Christ of faith is more important than the historical Jesus.
And preached by the Church.
But not all theologians share Bultmann's stark picture of Jesus, and not all discoveries have gone against the Gospels. Early this century, travelers encountered in Syria isolated communities who still spoke in Aramaic, the everyday language which Jesus himself would have spoken. The common written language of Jesus' time was Greek, the language in which the Gospels were written. Some scholars began to detect traces of Aramaic behind the Greek text of the Gospels, traces which they felt could indicate the original words Jesus had spoken. In the same way that "on the bridge at Avignon" translates into the much more rhythmic "sur le pont d'Avignon," so a few phrases in the Greek Gospels seem to form poetry when translated into Aramaic, as if they had once been passages designed by a teacher to be learnt by heart. Could that teacher have been Jesus? Many scholars say yes, but Bultmann's followers pointed out that the early church also spoke Aramaic. Traces of Aramaic certainly showed a passage was early, but not necessarily the words of Jesus. Many English scholars, notably the great Cambridge professor C.H. Dodd, refused to accept this rigid approach. They used a much wider set of criteria to determine authenticity. The account of Jesus' entry into Jerusalem, mounted on a donkey and surrounded by palm-waving crowds, is a good example of what they felt passed the test. It appears in all four Gospels. It fits in with known Jewish customs. It seems consistent